Hi, my name is Rob Knight, and welcome to this episode of Photography Basic Skills. Today I'm going to introduce you to the fundamentals of exposure. And when we talk about exposure in photography, we're basically talking about how bright or dark the image is. And really, that's the most important thing. All the bells and whistles and buttons and switches on your camera don't mean anything if you don't know how to make the exposure that you want. There's numerous videos and books and everything about the correct exposure. When the fact is, the correct exposure depends on what picture you're trying to make. So an understanding of how your camera sees and how to control the exposure is imperative so that you can visualize a picture that you want to make and then set your camera in order to capture that exposure. We control exposure in the camera with three settings: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And we refer to these three things together as the exposure triangle. You can adjust any corner of this triangle and use one or both of the other corners to correct your exposure to what you're looking for. I'm going to show you through the camera here in a minute exactly how that works and what it looks like. And in subsequent videos, I'm going to talk about how the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO affect your photographs creatively and visually so that you can make informed choices about which one of these settings you want to change at any given time. Now, when we talk about exposure in the camera, I'm going to use the term stops. And you've probably heard that if you've done any kind of photography training or talked to other photographers. We might close down a stop to limit the amount of light in the exposure, or we might open up a stop to let more light into the exposure. A stop is basically half as much light or twice as much light. If we reduce by one stop, that is half as much light in your exposure. And if we open up by one stop, increase by one stop, then that's twice as much light in your exposure. As you turn the dials on your camera to adjust the exposure, each click on that dial represents 1/3 of a stop. So if you want to open up a full stop and double the amount of light in your exposure, then you would move the dial 3 clicks. And if you want to cut that light by half, then you would move 3 clicks the other way. Often when you adjust the exposure to fine tune, you're going to be moving in 1 or 2/3 stops in increments and not necessarily moving a full stop at a time. Now, with the help of my friend Speedy back here, we're going to go into the camera and I'm going to show you through the lens what it looks like to adjust the settings in the exposure triangle. And hopefully I'll demonstrate very clearly how you can move one of these settings and use either one or both of the other two to dial in the exact exposure that you're looking for. So I've got my Olympus EM1 Mark III on a little tripod, and I've got a 25mm f1.8 lens on it. Now, when we talk about a lens being an f1.8 lens, that's the maximum aperture that lens can use. You can obviously stop down the lens from f1.8 to f2 to f2.8 and on down to f22 in most cases. But that's the fastest that the lens goes. And in terms of aperture, we talk a fast lens is a wide open aperture. So I've got Speedy all set up here, and I'm looking through the lens, and I have the exposure set for Speedy so that he is correct as far as the camera is concerned.
Your digital camera is capable of showing you a lot of information in the viewfinder, but we're going to concentrate on 4 settings today. We're going to talk about the camera's meter, the f-stop or the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The meter lets us know what the exposure is and whether the image is either under or overexposed. We can see that this image is correctly exposed because the marker or the needle on the meter is in the center, and the numbers to the left of the meter show 0.0. An underexposed image would have a minus number here, and an overexposed image would have a plus, letting you know exactly how much the image is over or underexposed. In the most basic terms, the aperture setting determines how much light comes into the exposure, the shutter speed determines how long the light comes in, and the ISO determines how sensitive the sensor is to light. Adjusting any of these 3 settings will make the image either brighter or darker depending on the change that you make. For this demonstration, I'm going to adjust the shutter speed first. And remember that as you turn the dials on your camera to adjust the shutter speed and the aperture, each click represents 1/3 of a stop. I turn the dial 3 clicks to reduce the light coming into the camera by 1 full stop. Notice that this is reflected not only in the shutter speed number, but also by the -1 on the camera's meter. Now, in order to get the exposure back to the correct exposure, or in this case to get the needle back into the center of the meter, we can either move the f-stop or the ISO. As you move one leg of the exposure triangle, you can use either one or both of the other settings to make up the difference. Adjusting to a faster shutter speed allows the light into the camera for a shorter period of time. So I'm going to open the aperture to allow more light into the exposure and get the needle back to 0. 3 clicks on the aperture dial and we are right back to 0 on the meter for our correct exposure. Now remember, there's 3 parts to the exposure triangle. We adjusted the f-stop to get our exposure correct, so now let's adjust the f-stop back down so that our image is underexposed and change the ISO. We can get to the exact same point with our exposure by adjusting either point of the exposure triangle. Some cameras have a dedicated ISO dial, but most of the time you will press the ISO button in order to make these changes. So I press the ISO button and turn the dial 3 clicks to move the ISO 1 full stop. Notice how the meter is once again at 0 and the needle is right in the center, showing us that our exposure is correct.
Understanding the exposure triangle and how it works is the first step towards understanding how to get the correct exposure in your camera. And like I mentioned earlier, the correct exposure is really up to you. You're the artist, right? You're the photographer, and this is about the story that you're trying to tell with your camera. So getting that basic understanding of exposure and how to work with it in your camera is the first step towards realizing your own vision. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. You can also email me at rob@robknightphotography.com, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.